Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Publics at IIHS. I'm really excited to welcome Andali Praman to come speak with us today about his new book, The Future of India's Social Safety Nets. Andalip used to be our colleague at IIHS many years ago, so it's very nice to have him back for this book talk. I'll just start by introducing Andalip and his work, and then give the floor to him for him to present the main findings of the book. And then we'll open it up for question and answers, as we always do. Andalip is a researcher at the Tata Cornell Institute at Cornell University. He works in the area of development economics with a particular focus on food policy, agricultural development, and social protection. He was published widely across a range of journals, including Food Policy, World Development, the Journal of Development Studies, Urban Studies, and so on. His first collaborative book on India's food systems was published in 2019. And today we're here to talk about his new book, which has been co-authored with Prabhu Pingali, the founding director of the Tata Cornell Institute. And what Andalip is here to talk about today is exceptionally timely, given that we've just finished a round of elections in the country and issues of our demographic change, how the market is changing, how jobs are changing, and just how important distress is becoming to political discourse has really been forefronted. But leaving that context aside, I think what's really exciting is the amount of research and the methodological way that you've gone about in structuring the book and structuring the investigation into how to understand the piecemeal approach that India has had to social policy. And given that I'm also someone who's really interested in how jobs are changing and displacement is coming through technology and just how livelihoods will be changed by will change with climate change, I think this is a really important moment to actually review the kind of historical lineage we have with social policy and how the state actually thinks about the future and the future of its citizens. So I am excited to be here today, and I'm going to stop and just let you take us through your book, and then we will come back for question and answers later. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditi, for a very generous introduction. And I'll get up and walk around while I speak. It's a great pleasure to be speaking for the first time in India on this book, and especially to a live audience. This has been a work in progress for a long time. Took us a while to come out finally with this book, a joint work with Professor Prabhu Pingali at Tata Cornell Institute, where I'm based at. And it builds upon the kind of work that we have been doing earlier. So all this is kind of motivates me to present it here, and especially excited to be at IIHS where I worked before I moved on to Cornell. So it's always great coming back to a place which has great in my academic career and personal life as well. So to get it started, I will just take you 2 days back on the issue of social protection programs in the country. Day one of the new government, the first thing that Prime Minister did was to sign a file to release amount of money for Kisan Nidhi, which is commonly known as PM Kisan, which is nothing but 6,000 rupees annual installment to every farmer in the country. The second thing is 3 crores home, which is commonly known as the PM Awas Yojana, where subsidized housing subsidy is provided to build homes. So these are what we call subsidies in general parlance, in the financial parlance, but these are part of the social protection programs which any government provides to its citizens. And these are cash transfers when it comes to PM Kisan or the PMAY. But there are other programs as well. Cash transfers being one of the most debated in the recent times. So while PM Modi, as part of Modi 3 on day one, signed PM Kisan, the other political party which fought this election, and one of their principal agenda was this Nyaya scheme, which as we commonly know in which 1 lakh per year was to be provided to every poor family in India as an unconditional transfer. So while PM Kisan is targeted to farmers as 6,000 rupees per year, they had promised 1 lakh per year to every poor Indian family. And while there's been the political debates this time before the election, things haven't changed a lot because the government was actually giving free ration to poor, especially during the times of the pandemic, while National Food Security Act gives every poor the opportunity to avail 35 kilos for the household or 5 kilograms per person in a household, depending on the state that you're in, or if you fall above or below the poverty line. So what it essentially means, there is a greater and greater debate in the country around how to help the poor, be it cash transfers through PM Kisan housing scheme, or the promise of a Mahalakshmi scheme or a Nyaya scheme, or the political mileage that a leader gets out of giving rations to poor, which was already existing, but then they increased during times of COVID, of course. Times were bad and you needed to do something like that because most people couldn't afford any food, and food being the basic necessity. So these are not the only schemes that exist in the country, which what this book covers. They are an array of welfare programs in the country, which traverse across an individual's life cycle, as you see in this graph. So what I've tried to do is to cover many of these programs. This is immunization, cash transfers, or cash transfers given to young mothers when the childbirth takes in an institutional facility. ICDS is a program where nutritional assistance is provided to young women who are pregnant or to very young children before they enter school. Then we have the MDMS, which is commonly known as the midday meal scheme, now known as PM Poshan, where a child, if it goes to a public school, they are given free hot cooked meals at school as an afternoon meal. While later, for livelihood security and other food and health security, there are a range of other programs. Everyone knows MG and IIHS, also called Manrega, where any rural person can go and work for 100 days at a minimum wage, and they're entitled to it as part of the right to work. PDS, as I just talked about, the public distribution system, has been existing for the last 80 years now. Then we have PMJAY, which is the health insurance program. Then PM Kisan, cash transfers, housing subsidy, livelihood support. There are a range of programs which exist, and in later ages, you have the old age support exam, social pensions, where every old person, if he or she belongs to a below poverty line household, are entitled to a certain stipulated amount. So these programs we have been talked about a lot in the literature. There's a range of literature by various kinds of social scientists, even non-social scientists who are trying to look at the technological aspect of it. And why do these programs exist? So in this book, we are not focused on one program, which has generally been the case with most of the studies that you would find. We are taking stock of the range of social welfare programs that exist, and that's why we are trying to understand them as a system, and that's the crux of this book. We create a framework in this book, and I'll come back to it again, but I just want to give you a teaser in which we talk about the focus, form, and scope of the book, because each of these programs are a certain form of transfers. It could be cash, it could be in kind like rice or wheat, it could be nutritional support, it could be immunization, or other kind of support. There is a scope, because if in early childbirth interventions, you are probably looking at either institutional birth or better nutrition, or because of gender disparity beginning, you're trying to support young women so that they get better nutrition and so on. Overall, a child and a child's mother get better nutrition, and which kind of puts them on the path to intergenerational prosperity. School meals program exists with the scope of reducing classroom hunger, which kind of has been very important in the last 20 years in bringing kids to school too, and now we have almost 100% gross enrollment ratio. While the other livelihood programs, as I said, exist for a range of different scope. And they exist because there are certain risks, economic risk, health risk, livelihood risk over the course of a person's life. And we're trying to understand how the Indian government has tried to grapple it over a period of time, and given how things are changing in the sense of politics, in the sense of economics, and also in the sense of social sphere, while you need different kinds of programs. So that's the essential idea of the book. While there are an array of social welfare programs, let's try to understand, while despite having some of the largest welfare transfers in the world in the form of many of these schemes, we still have very high levels of poverty and vulnerability. And while these programs are probably one of the largest in the world, India also is host to the most number of poor people and people also who are vulnerable to poverty, including very, very high levels of child malnutrition. So where did the social welfare program or the strategy go wrong? We often hear criticisms about it in terms of it's being inefficient, that it probably doesn't do as much as it could in terms of the amount of money that's being spent. There are tons of studies on how corrupt the system is, but there are also pejorative terms like these welfare transfers could be handouts, doles, and freebies, which sometimes inhibit the functioning of these programs. And also, there's a lot of claiming of who implements these programs, so which kind of gives a negative image to the program as probably not essential, not useful, and a waste of public money. In the book, we are trying to understand where has the policy gone wrong. Is it just bad implementation? Is it probably they're not sufficient enough and the poverty or vulnerability exists in the country is far higher? Or there's an absence of larger welfare strategy on how to think about poverty, vulnerability, deprivation on various indicators that one can think of. So that's where we start this book. The contributions upfront are, first of all, to create a framework around how to think about these issues. Say, I started my PhD dissertation thinking about issues of a public distribution system. So I was so narrowly focused on one question that I didn't get a big picture of what it actually means in terms of a social welfare strategy. And how should I think about PDS vis-a-vis, say, MGNREGS or ICDS, which is also nutritional assistance. So here we are kind of creating a framework to understand why these social protections are important, how they're effective, and which helps us to think about how can they be redesigned in the future. But to talk about future, we really need to understand how these programs actually came about. What was the macro historical changes which brought them, what made them change with time, because these programs have evolved over a period of time, which allows us to kind of understand why some of these welfare ideas may be well formed, maybe not, were not probably implemented well. And that's why we don't see some of the impact assessment to be positive, while there has been a lot of positive impact of these programs. There are intense debates on in terms of whether they should be focuses, in terms of focused on the poor versus non-poor. There are debates in terms of whether we should just give everyone cash or universal basic income. But there are also questions around what do we want to achieve by these social welfare programs? Is it just making sure that people step on outside of the poverty trap, or we are also making sure that the people not only fall outside of the poverty level, but also become resilient to any exogenous shock which might throw them into the poverty trap? So that's the kind of impact assessment we are trying to do here, which allows us, as I said, to envisage how the future of these programs should be. And some of the major thread that we are working on is high levels of child malnutrition and gender disparities. Social programs need to be in tune with these, probably the stickiest of developmental challenges. Then we have issues in the farm, with farm incomes not rising as high as they're desired. And we all know what's been happening in the country over the last 2-3 years in terms of farmer protests, and which actually hasn't told us much about the degree of farm distress that exists actually, or the challenges of agriculture, despite it being rolled back. Then there are challenges in the urban areas or even in the rural areas because of informality of work. Most people that we encounter while walking in a street are probably working in an informal sector. Estimates suggest that 95% of India's workforce is in the informal sector, and which is also a result of the kind of stunted transformation of overall economy, and especially of rural areas. Many research papers have characterized India's economy as economic transformation as stunted, and by stunted we mean that while agriculture rural GDP has kept on declining, the number of people in agriculture hasn't, which means the productivity per agriculture worker remains very low. So that's on the economy side. But actually, if you look at rural spaces and urban transformation, which a lot of work happens at IIHS, and I've borrowed it from, rural spaces are also kind of not urbanizing in the sense of vibrant economic activity. While they may be reclassified from rural to urban, but neither do they have urban amenities, nor do they have the jobs which one would imagine in an urban space, which leads to a different kind of vulnerability and risks, which means social protection needs to be tuned to that. And as I'll talk about in a bit, most of these programs are actually for rural people, while India is urbanizing at a faster pace and will go on. So when one thinks about the future, this must surely be in policymakers' mind. The first one here is the nature of diseases are changing. Infectious disease to non-communicable diseases. While much of the health programs in India, as we had public healthcare system, was designed for infectious disease. Now there's a greater incidence of non-communicable disease, which means greater financial cost to the household. And in the absence of quality healthcare infrastructure or health insurance, which supports them, given most of the people, most of the workers are outside of the formal sector employment and do not have access to employment-based insurance, there is a huge loss of income at different stages of your life, which of course impinges on your consumption, expenditure, and investments in future productive activities. The last one is, we all talk about the great demographic dividend India can achieve. But if you look at the numbers, the UN projections for 2050, India is also aging fast. As the health infrastructure has become better, as longevity has increased, there is also a problem of people aging. And if you think of so many workers retiring or choosing not to work at a certain point later in their life and do not have access to either health insurance or any of these benefits, it means huge cost to the family in a multi-generational setup that most Indian households are into. So these are some of the challenges that one thinks about the social protection programs going ahead in the future. So we, in the book, talk about poverty, not the best indicator for thinking about social protection, but rather resilience. And resilience, as we define in the book, the ability of an individual, a house, or a society to withstand not only an adverse shock that they might exist now, but also to ensure in the future, in case an exogenous shock falls, and it could be anything, it could be climate disaster, it could be health disaster, it could be something like COVID, you kind of are able to still withstand that and probably grow further, so that you're able to invest in right productive capacity as a household. So that's essentially the crux of what my arguments would be. Before I go into different social programs in India, I want to kind of do a very short tour of what the theory and evidence around social welfare is globally. Why is social protection important? Social protection, as I said, is important because households are vulnerable to income, livelihood, health, and different kinds of risks. The state promises citizens that will ensure that in case something falls upon them and they cannot control it, it'll promise them to support. So think about food insecurity. PDS existed many, many years ago in 1943. It started off because it was the government at that time, which was the colonial empire, worried that there could be riots in the urban areas given World War going on. So ensure at least there's sufficient food on people's plate, because of course people couldn't afford to have food at the reasonable price. And also India was a much more food deficit than it is now. There are great moral imperatives which kind of intertwine with how a government is formed in terms of social justice, where the government of its time promises its people a social minimum, which is essential to maintain a decent life, which is essential in, as in Amartya Sen's framing, the capability to function to their abilities. And also it ensures they have a sense of self-worth and dignity of belonging to a certain place where the government promises to take care of them. So there are moral imperatives for social protection programs. Social protection programs are also a way to redistribute the pot of income that a country has or the resources that a country has, and also has its potential for transformative change. There's this very influential work by Subats, Whaler, and Devereux suggest that they could be used to spur up consumption needs, address structural inequalities, create opportunities for all, and stem the intergenerational poverty, and which requires different kinds of scheme at different points in time. And India has many of these schemes, but probably not implemented as effectively. And one can debate about it, and that's what the book is about. Social protection programs also, by stemming the flow of people into poverty and by giving them some basic wherewithal to ensure that they are able to be capable and function well, it ensures there is greater productivity increase and greater consumption demand, which kind of puts the country on the cycle of economic growth. So that's basically the scope of social protection program. Across countries, if you see, most of the countries which are richer have greater emphasis on labor regulation and social insurance. So many of us here who are employed in formal sector have social insurance, which basically means if we fall ill, we have some form of insurance by our employer. It could also be publicly subsidized, which is now increasingly with the Ayushman Bharat scheme, you can see that. But in poorer countries, bulk of the people fall into social assistance kind of social protection policies where there are direct transfers, like many of these schemes that I talked about. There are public works program where you work at a minimum wages and the government sponsors that. Direct transfers could take the form of cash, nutritional assistance, and we see many of these in the form of old age pensions, universal entitlements, something like a PM Kisan now, while nutritional assistance are school meals, early life interventions. Very highly developed countries have very strict labor regulations, which include minimum wage laws, which many of these even low and medium income countries have, but also very high employment benefits and training programs. So in case they are switching jobs or are laid off in one job, they are trained and skilled enough to get to the other job. But what you see in what you see in practice actually over a period of time, that it doesn't happen at one go. Countries have gone through a phase of moving from basic needs, which is the provision like a PDS, which is focused on poor, which has very basic minimum needs, to addressing some of the risk which exists because of health risk and unemployment risk, to creating better economic opportunity, creating avenues for asset building, skill building, which also includes poor and non-poor because there are greater resources that a country has. It's also the phase during which a country grows from an agriculture to a non-agricultural country, and also democratic deepening. One can think about where India is at this point in time on this spectrum, and many of us may have different views. But essentially, this is the idea that this is a path that countries globally have gone towards to achieve something we aim to reach at. There's no one metric for is development resilience, where in case an unforeseen event happens to me or my family or the community as a whole, my endowments in terms of income, asset, health, and investments in my children, health, and many of the or business doesn't go down as much as, or probably remains at the same level. That's where you become resilient. If you look at the graph where we plot GDP per capita across different countries, these are numbers for 2017, and the share of expenditure on the y-axis on social protection programs. You see some of the richest countries actually spend most on social protection, which to someone might come as a surprise, like why do rich countries actually need social protection programs? But also if you think of it in the other way, that's how they've ensured that the resources or the avenues that they have for further growth, they've ensured that it kind of gets redistributed in a better manner. Also, richer countries are in a better position to spend on the poor, or even those who are, the numbers for richer countries in terms of poverty is not so high, but they're just trying to ensure they're more inclusive. And the distinction between poor and non-poor is probably far higher at this bottom GDP per capita level. And India falls somewhere here. And sometimes even lower than many of the other lower medium income countries, which it is classified as. The kind of social protection coverage, as I said, high and upper middle income countries spend more on social insurance and labor market expenditure, as I just talked about, while the poor countries include low and medium income countries, and low income countries have a greater share of their social protection coverage in terms of social assistance, which includes cash and kind transfers and all the other schemes. So the nature of social assistance too, if you find it's interesting that most of the in-kind transfers, in poor countries, much of social assistance goes on in-kind transfers and some bit of public works, but not a lot on cash and conditional cash transfers. It is changing. Countries like Brazil and Mexico have been the flag bearers of conditional cash transfers. While cash transfers are being implemented in various countries in Africa, and especially in post-COVID era, they've really taken off as one of the ways to help poor because, cash has its benefit, which one can go into, but the idea here is to say that richer countries spend more on social insurance and less on direct social assistance. The crux of our argument in the book is the impact of social welfare programs in India is insignificant, but much less than anticipated for the amount of money that's spent. And why is it so? A historical perspective of it tells us that much of these programs have been introduced, ideated, implemented as a response to various economic and political exigencies. So this is where we plot out various programs and their timings as they were implemented. So as I mentioned that in 1943, when the World War was on, PDS was implemented as an urban program in India under the colonial empire. There was no other program till 1973 when Maharashtra government implemented a public works program, which is kind of a precursor to MGNRHS in 1973 on the back of severe incidences of famine and droughts in that region. ICDS, the Mother and Child Nutrition Program, was implemented as a pilot basis in 1975. The Old Age Pension Program was implemented in 1995, a very meager amount of 200 then. And 95, if you think of it, 1990 was the time when India did economic liberalization. And before that, as I said, the different economic exigencies, there were frequent food shortages as a result of which Maharashtra implemented employment guarantee program. There wasn't much in any of the other states, so political leadership in the state kind of took it on upon themselves. Later on, in the late 60s and early 70s, India became sufficient in food production, which means there was surplus food. So PDS kind of became more of a rural program and got enshrined across the country. So from its urban focus, it became a rural program in 1990s. And comes 1991, when India, as it undertook economic reforms, and it was realized that PDS is being very inefficient, it was moved from a universal program, which means anyone in the country is entitled to it, to a means-based targeting program, which means for the first time, the APL and BPL that we very commonly hear, above poverty line and below poverty line, cards were distributed in the country. When the government ought to identify who is a poor, which means who is more of worthy of these entitlements. So there were a cutback on many of these programs, which anyway were probably not working the way they were thought of, and PDS was the solitary program then. EWG kind of had died very soon after its inception in Maharashtra. Till 2001, there was not much happening when the Rights-Based Act became prominent. There were cases of famine-related deaths in state of Odisha. The right to education was being talked about by activists. A more amenable government in 2004 came out with right to information, right to work, right to food, so on. That led to a more entrenchment, or probably the first of its kind, of a period where you saw social architecture being established of some kind in India. Even midday meal schemes, which existed in some of the southern states in a different way, were being promoted in rest of the countries, and judicial activism along with civil society activism in early 2000s and until in 2010s led to innumerable schemes which exist currently. So if you see here, NREGA NREGA called then, the Act came in 2005. 2013 was when National Food Security Act came in. 2008 was when health insurance in the form of Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana was introduced, and then repackaged in 2018 as Ayushman Bharat. PM Kisan, which was the first thing that I showed you this evening, was introduced in 2019, and subsequently in the last 5 years, the money and the coverage has been expanding. At the same time, the policy focus on nutrition and health became more important. So you see a clear trajectory of welfare becoming more and more important in the country, as not only has India grown faster, but also where per capita income as country has risen. But also it has brought to light that so many of the poor people in India probably don't have the same kind of life that a tiny few have, and which is something which is important for economics, for politics. So the crux of the argument here is that there has been no concerted thought to various social protection programs. There have been a response to different exigencies. And that's why their scope, developmental scope, as I talked about, is still much narrower than one would imagine. Say PDS, the scope, developmental scope is still consumption smoothing or just in-kind transfer, which means it's just preventive in the sense of people not falling below a minimum understood threshold of poverty. Other programs have different scope, but still much narrower than what would imagine to build a social protection program which is more encompassing, which is more equitable and more expansive. Things are changing for the better, regardless of the political parties, regardless of who comes to power in center. There has been a lot of change, and I'll talk about how different state governments have taken leadership in doing that. Also means the focus of these programs have changed from only poverty earlier or rural poor to much more broader. There's more focus, like the Nyaya thing had focused on women. And despite Congress not coming to power, many of the state government, and regardless of their belong to BJP or Congress, have many of these programs on their own. So the focus, as you see, has been changing from rural and poor to various different aspects of underdevelopment. Still, as we talk about, the scope is narrower because many of these programs are new and there is very strong politics behind it, which means the efficiency argument still remains to be seen. Why has India not been able to think about social welfare in a way that many of the other countries thought about it, or probably what are the factors which inhibited its own implementation of these programs which had right ideas? So we use the theory of political processes of policy making, where 3 I's, as they called, ideas, interests, and institutions being the fulcrum around which any program is designed, implemented, and ultimately you see their outcome. So you can think about any program, you'll see an idea comes in, the politicians, civil society set up an agenda, and the policies, focus, form, and scope are defined. These ideas are not independent of what's happening in the rest of the world. Like if you see the cash transfer debate, India has learned a lot from what's happening in the other countries. Countries have learned from each other. It's also dependent on the nature of structural transformation of that country itself, and also the kind of economy that we see in the rest of the world. Their interest, of course, what kind of programs do you have? So someone talks about, say, instead of hot-cooked meals in school, you should be given a nutrient-dense biscuits or something else. So of course, there are different interests. They may have their good and bad, but power, politics, the kind of society that you're in determine those interests, and then the policy design. There is a feedback which happens between different policy and how they're implemented. And lastly, there are last mile delivery agents, which are bureaucrats, which are local politicians. There is decentralization of both identifying the poor and implementing the program. All of these are not perfect in India, and that's why the welfare outcomes we see are not the one we would want. But still, we have come a long way, and the debate in the country is now structured much more around these programs and ways to fix sometimes last mile delivery, sometimes to kind of understand the political interests and how to overcome those conflicts. So think about historically how these programs have come about and its impact. This becomes very important, which is a central aspect of our book. Which allows us to diagnose why welfare outcomes have been incommensurate. First of all, to put it very simply, there has been a very feeble social contract, and social contract is defined as the contract between the citizen and a nation state in terms of what ought the citizen gets from the government vis-a-vis their belonging to a certain sovereignty. Atul Kohli, in his very famous book, talked about a clear absence of real commitment among state elites, who, if you remember from the last slide, are the most important actor to put the developmental agenda on the policy plate. Poor quality of peripheral bureaucracy, which means last mile implementations, but most of all, powerful vested interests. And you can put any of these programs or debates that you hear on TV or read in different research papers. These are essentially as a result of feeble social contract, and it's It's devoid of any government that has been in the country, especially if you go back before 2000s. The social question historically has been addressed through identity-based political representation rather than citizenship rights. So with only right to work and food, you see some of these citizenship rights coming into play. But generally, whenever the social question comes up as part of the social contract, it was about identity. So first is social contract. The second is low state capacity for the government to actually think about how to deliver welfare. And this state capacity is understood as the organizational ability, which includes implementation, getting the funding, thinking about reforming the programs to deliver welfare. It is fraught with challenges, and the challenges lead to elite capture and clientelism on the local level, where if I am the local elector, I'll probably give the APL or BPL card to people I know, or even sometimes when I'm deserving, I don't get it because I don't have the power. So local institutions could be corrupt. There are bureaucratic inefficiencies with much less accountability. So many of the deserving in many of these programs do not get what they're entitled to and what they deserve. The third is weak public systems. So here, a good example to give, say, midday meal scheme is implemented in the perfect manner that one would imagine in the country. So all school children who go to public system schooling get great food, which is healthy, hygienic. That doesn't happen most of the time. But without quality teachers, quality infrastructure at school, you're not going to see the impact that you would want from a midday meal scheme. So weak public systems become important. Similarly, in Anganwadis, if you go and these women who work as Anganwadi workers are occupied, do not have the time, do not have the right tools, they are not going to benefit or even speak to the women and children who come there. So which means the hard infrastructure, despite a lot of push in the last decade or so, since 2000s actually, we are still very weak on these public systems. There's a great euphoria around building soft infrastructure, which is largely the digital identity, financial inclusion, mobiles, etc. I mean, these things which are in the news every other day. But the hard infrastructure is still lacking, and the impact that we would want to see, is still not there because of weak public systems. So three things why India doesn't have the social protection impact from the program is absence of social contract, weak, low state capacity, and weak public systems, which includes ineffective grievance redressal. So there's a lot to come, but I think I have less time, so I'll skip over some of these things, but I'll leave you with some of the peculiarities of India's challenge, especially in terms of its economics. Okay, thanks, yeah. So what are the peculiarities of India's developmental challenge for social protection? First of it, as I told you about, its structural transformation, where GDP per capita has increased, these dotted line, share of industry in the total output has remained constant, which is generally understood to be the sector which employs bulk of the unskilled worker. Share of agriculture has declined. Share of services has share of services in the total output has increased. But if you look at employment share in this panel B, agriculture still employs almost the majority of workers in the country, while its output is declining. So what do we do with the welfare of these people who are still stuck in agriculture, either as farmers or workers? While service sector growth or industrial growth has largely led to informalization of labor. Poverty surely has declined in the country if you see these numbers, and these are money metric poverties, which we all know are couched either in calorie norms and now recently in based on the total minimum basic needs of expenditure. At the same time, you see inequality in the country really rising. And these are numbers for the top 10% of people, their income share in the total GDP. This has been a lot of debate in the last 10 years as the debate on inequality has kind of moved across the globe on different contexts. So that's the economic challenge, where you have people still stuck in agriculture while overall share of agriculture in the GDP has declined. Poverty has declined while inequality has increased, which means there's something wrong, there's something more happening. At the same time, the most vexing challenge, which I'll discuss more in detail, is about stunted children and undernourished mothers in India, which means intergenerationally, you're not going to prosper as much when your women and children are unhealthy and undernourished. So this is India's peculiar challenge. What it ultimately leads to is very poor performance on human developmental index or human capital index as the World Bank defines. I mean, these indices have their own problem, but they're largely indicative of what's happening in the country. So these gray dots are where other low and medium income countries are. So India is probably not very high even among the other low and medium income countries for a country at similar levels of income, either in HDI or human capital index. If you look at any of the other welfare metrics, and I'm not sticking to poverty metric consumption, poverty here, India is performing poorly on many of these indicators, and these remain some of the pressing challenges: informality, savings, female labor force participation, schooling, anemia, stunting, inequality, and so forth. So that's how this book places the social protection debate in India and the challenge. So you can think of one program, but you have to think of what it implies for other developmental deficits which exist in the country. The other very important challenge is that different states of India are in different stage of their structural transformation. Bihar and Haryana are so different as Haryana and Tamil Nadu in terms of the vulnerability and poverty they exist. And I give the example of Haryana and Tamil Nadu, say, which are all, both high in per capita income, but the nature of their labor force, if you look more detailed, is also different, because in Punjab and Haryana, a large share of population is still in rural areas. Agriculture may be more profitable, but they're also facing the brunt of agriculture being challenged through lack of underground resources, underground water resources, and other things. Similarly, the challenges of poverty and inequality. Level of industrialization is also different in these states. So welfare programs need to really understand that deciding from Delhi is not going to solve the problem, because different states are grappling with different challenge. Overall, you see a multidimensional poverty index is largely negatively associated with per capita GDP, which means states with a higher per capita income have lower multidimensional poverty. But multidimensional poverty is not the best indicator in many ways, because it kind of combines undernutrition to health challenges to poverty. But it's largely indicative, at least in the sense that if state which is richer, they have lower poverty. Nutrition is a completely different welfare metric, and there's a lot of debate, especially in India, trying to understand why some of the states which have higher income are still grappling with higher levels of malnutrition. But the crux of this is that India's peculiar challenges lies in structural transformation being stunted, and different states are at different levels of structural transformation, and they have their own labor market, informality, inequality, and health challenges. And so what we do in each of these chapters of the book, we go deep dive into each of these programs and talk about what do we know and how should we think about these programs. So broadly speaking, livelihood programs, which include PM Kisan to NREGS to old age pensions, what we say, they started off mostly as agricultural development program or rural development program, and they had focused on irrigation, initially with IRDP, which was called Integrated Rural Development Program, where subsidy was given to build irrigation infrastructure. And of course, in 1978, irrigation was with very few people who were largely rich landholders. And the social protection question then probably was misplaced, because relatively rich large landholders, and by rich I don't mean they were really rich, but they're more than others, is not going to succeed in terms of actually empowering the poorest and bringing them above to a certain level of human development. So they started off there, but now if you look at the trajectory, they have moved to PM Kisan. In between, they tried with MG and RGS. IIHS works on urban issues a lot. So these blue ones are interesting, because these are the only programs which talked about urban issues. This is NRY, which was analogous to JRY, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana. This was I don't remember all of these anagrams, but Nehru Rozgar Yojana, yes. So right now, what you see is only the Urban Livelihood Mission, which is kind of a social protection program where you're thinking about skilling, but not social protection program in terms of actually making some kind of transfers. So much of the programs, welfare programs which exist on livelihoods are PM Kisan, which are public works programs. So rural development programs have been subsumed as Deen Dayal Upadhyay urban livelihood program. So what you want to take, what you should take from this is that there was no concerted attempt at thinking about what ails rural areas. What is the ultimate challenge to bring people up to a certain level of decent living in the. So what has it has ended up with is either NREGS or PM Kisan. And PM Kisan is for those who actually farm, so you get some money to them. NREGS are agriculture workers who can work on basic minimum wages. But does it lead to rural upliftment in terms of creating a vibrant rural society, in terms of creating a skilled rural workforce? I don't know. I mean, I would kind of reckon that it still doesn't lead to a transformational change in the rural society or overall economy, but this is where social protection debate is, which proves the point that we are raising here in this book is that there has been no clear, concerted attempt at thinking around the problems of social deprivation. Going ahead in the future, the livelihood challenge essentially lies in the farm areas in terms of India has 90% of farmers who are marginal, which have less than 1 hectare of land. A land which is so small, how can you make it productive? And just by giving them money, are you going to bring them to a sustainable livelihood going in the future? So this is the most important challenge where you see large share of smallholders have a smaller amount of land. The second one is the nature of urbanization, as I spoke about, is that much of the rural areas have been converted into urban areas, while these areas do not have a vibrant economic activity going on. So livelihood challenge remains pertinent. The third one is informality of employment, regardless of where you are in the rural urban areas. Informality is everywhere. And then there is aging population. You see population distribution. You see it shifting towards a little older population, which means you need to care about the elderly in terms of how are these people who are in informal employment going to work or live their life, probably never retire, or probably retire with ill health, going ahead. Summarizing briefly, the major rural challenge is lower farm sizes, stagnant farm income, structural transformation in terms of both labor and human capital. Urbanization is what often characterized as subaltern urbanization, which means rural spaces being urban and not economically vibrant. Migrants, we all know, I mean, I don't have to belabor this point. We probably some of the most poignant pictures coming from the pandemic where migrant workers walking barefoot back to their villages with their families. Informality of employment is something I already talked about. So these are future for livelihood challenges in India. So current livelihood programs need future proofing, and we need to think about it. I'm going to skip some of these programs. I'll rather go to summarize where you can read in the book. It's freely available. Again, a plug. Anyone can download. PDF is free. You can write to me if you have any questions. I'll answer. I am going to the end of it, which is to summarize basically what we learned here. I'm not going to talk about the health insurance, which is also there. RSBY and then Ayushman Bharat has become to go-to programs. We also discuss in the book the most contemporary debates on welfare reforms in India. And this is something that all of you read probably, and whenever you turn a daily newspaper, is that when is the time to move from PDS to cash transfer? We argue that it's theoretically elegant, but without market infrastructure, without sufficient income, financial literacy among people, trust in government, credibility in the government to actually deliver on these cash transfers indexed to inflation is something we don't know. In-kind transfers also create collective voices because you can actually see something like rice being distributed in your neighborhood, so you understand the government is doing something for you. It also brings the community together to kind of petition for other programs. So collective voices is something that in-kind transfer can create, while a cash anonymously transferred to your bank account from somewhere doesn't do. The politics of food procurement makes it even more tricky to move from a PDS in-kind transfers to a cash transfer. UBI in our mind is still premature in India, while the idea is fine, but the preconditions which I just told you about, still we haven't reached there. And most importantly, in the parlance of the terminology which we use in the book, what is the scope of UBI, developmental scope? Is it to address child nutrition? Is it to address just income transfer, like just an addition to the income, or to address rural wage and vulnerability? So there is still lack of clarity on actually the developmental scope that UBI is aiming to address, if that becomes a source of debate in the country. There is a lot of emphasis on technological solution, the Aadhaar, everyone has a bank account, everyone has an Aadhaar number, everyone has a cell phone. This will probably be an anathema to any of the problems that we have in terms of the holy trinity of reaching the poor. It's fine, but I mean, I guess everyone in the room knows there are challenges of implementing it, first of all. And the second, does it actually circumvent local corruption? It makes it easy for the government to actually reach it to people, but does it make it easy for the citizens to address their grievances? Does it empower them? And of course, it needs complementary inputs, which are bureaucratic incentives and accountability. Does it change? Because if I am the local person, whatever, be a government or non-government, political person involved, does it actually change the relationship I have with the citizens who need it? So these are some of the challenges as we think about using technology. Because also, what I would want you to take away from this is social welfare programs are also a larger package of building a vibrant social democracy. And without citizens being empowered sufficiently enough, that's not going to change. When we talk about citizens, there is, of course, a debate about how federalism in India works. Subnational government, as I told you, have been subnational government hereby mean different states, have been the real champions of social welfare since 2000. And there has been a lot of fight between the center and the state in terms of who stakes claim for these programs. And this is a very nice paper by Steve Wilkinson, where he uses data to show how people attribute MG and RGS and say PM Awas Yojana on whether to central and state government. And what he says that between 2014 to 19, more and more people credit the central government for these programs, which means there is a tension between the center and state and to centralize these programs more. Of course, the pejorative terms like freebies and doles come in and creates more tension between the center and the state. To give you two very clear examples of this is from the state of West Bengal, where when the PM logo was not put on the on some of the schemes, the center withheld money transfer to the state. On the other hand, Rajasthan was one of the first states to actually implement right to health, and it had its own Chiranjeevi health insurance program, which had over and above what Ayushman Bharat had. So the Congress government implemented it, but the moment BJP government came back in power, they merged the two. But what happens to people who actually were relying on the health card that most people get on the Chiranjeevi health insurance, which makes citizens in a state of limbo on what to do. So many of these knee-jerk reactions and competition between the center and state makes the social protection program ineffective. So what we argue is a way to resolve this is to actually rationalize welfare as a merit good, where it's not a public good but a merit good, which basically means public investment to improve developmental possibilities, which also brings it into the parlance of entitlement as we are talking about. We talked about the ways the government can actually raise resources, but I'm not going to go in detail. You should go and look at the book. To summarize, we are saying that India has a fledgling social protection program architecture. There are an array of schemes with different multiple developmental goals. Its impact has been limited because of inefficiencies. Reforms have been hinted for a variety of reasons. It has also become a handmaiden of populism. And how do we move from actually these independent schemes to a social economic security system? And this is what we call resilient households, where not only these programs exist, which have a form, focus, and scope, and are a response to different different risks, but also they need very strong public system enablers, which includes economic growth, access to credit, healthcare, water and sanitation, data systems, governance, and equity. Because these programs in isolation are not going to create a resilient household. They're not going to create an economic security system. So we argue that when we think about these schemes, which must be thinking about system where public systems or public investments are as important. Sorry, yeah. So this is the system that we are talking about, which also kind of talks about the need to have a very clear articulation of the form, focus, and scope of these programs, especially against the challenges of prosperity as well as poverty, the two Indias that we talk about in the country. These are some of the major headline indicators of where India should work on and debate on these programs. They need developmental enablers, as I talked about, which means a capable state, empowered citizens, political commitment to welfare as a merit good. Other contributions of this book means we should think of social welfare program as something over the period of individuals' life cycle, which propels them on a path of intergenerational prosperity, equality of opportunity, inclusive growth, which all builds a vibrant social democracy. In the future, we should think about how to make resilient societies, how to make these programs universal so that no one is left behind. One can use a combination of tools depending on the context, which means space and time. As I said, space could be region, could be even local places, and also with time, as different states or different country moves on with changes in rural urban, changes of nature of urbanization, jobs, health indicators. So that is clearly important, and none of this can happen without a very strong political coalition building and institutionalized support to create a welfare architecture where welfare of citizen is prioritized. There are avenues for experimentation. Innovation is more decentralized, and citizens are at the heart of welfare delivery. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. That was incredibly, the scope of your work is really incredible. And I think for context, for people who maybe don't work on this, many people will spend lifetimes trying to really study pensions and see what their impact are or why they're framed in a particular way or to study one system. The fact that you've been able to look at all of these as a system is something that's really been missing. And I think it's an exceptional offering to the world of policy and researchers and academia. And it's an open access book, which is also an incredible thing to happen in this day and age. So I think really both those things we need to commend you on and thank you for.
Thank you.
So, we are going to spend about 5, 7, 10 minutes on questions. And because we're running towards the end of the hour, I wanted to actually see if there are people in the audience here or online that wanted to just put their questions in. And then we can take those first because I have many things that have cropped into my mind, but I've had my 2 minutes here on stage. So anyone here in our audience? Okay, Tanu in the front. And Rasha, maybe you can hand it to Amoga.
Thanks. It was really interesting to see the breadth of work, and I look forward to reading it. And especially, I had some questions regarding the center and state tensions, but I think I'll read the book rather than asking it here since we have limited time. But I just wanted to ask regarding this idea of social protection, like, where do we see the role of the non-state actors? Because they are present, and in that ways, they're present in a multifaceted way when we look at it. From one side of the political economic aspects of vying for representation and kind of taking over the state's role in certain places and then kind of becoming the political representative, and the pathways from that to another is that there have been local experiments which work out and then they have been taken over by the state and they have been scalable in that aspect. So like and this idea of also trust deficit which is there, which is like the idea in India that there's a trust deficit in government in many places and many cases. Where do we see them? They can be actors who are bridging this gap, but that also brings a lot of different other questions, because is it targeted to specific groups or is it democratic in nature in that ways? And like, so where do we see that role and space? That's something which I was just wondering.
Oh, great. That's actually a great question, because here I talked about the citizen-state social contract where citizen and state are maybe, deciding on the responsibilities of each other, but it doesn't happen like that. Their citizens are also social beings who have their civic organization. So it is as important as the presence of a government, because even in the historical evolution of social welfare programs, civic society came as the biggest champion of the cause of poor. And the civic society means a collection of people who are representatives or who are raising their voice and articulating their needs to the government. So they are as essential in terms of identifying where are the bottlenecks in terms of championing the cause with the government, taking it to them. But I'm talking about at the macro level, where these are organized, more organized setup which can actually speak to the government. But there are also civil activities going on, civil society groups, and they could take different forms from NGOs to even informal civic organizations who are actually working on the ground to bridge that connection between the local representative. It could be the panchayat person or the local bureaucrat who mobilize these voices, which also includes many of these social audits which are now common in RGA and many of these programs. So they become very important. They are as important as any other element of a social protection system. How do they function? They can only function in a place where they're listened to, and they're also limited by the amount of effort they can put in, but they become the channels to address citizen voices to the local representative or then collection of this to higher authorities. So they are as important. I would actually also like to talk about other non-state actors, which could be corporates, which could be other firms, which through their CSRs or through various other organizations, which they now increasingly fund, create a system where they are helping government, they are helping citizens in addressing these developmental deficits. And it could take many forms. One of them could be through greater contribution to taxes, through CSR, helping these organizations. I'm not coming up with the precise answer to this in terms of how they can, because they can be with many ways. But what I wanted to say is there are different levels at which civil society, non-governmental organizations can come up. Yeah.
Amol, you want to go ahead?
Right. Thanks, Antalip. So this question is still forming in my head, so I'm not quite sure if I'll get it right. But let me just let me just try.
You're good.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on, how the topics that you've kind of covered in your book link to some of the more contemporary debates globally that have been taking place on the role of the state in ensuring social protection, especially in the last 4 or 5 years since the pandemic. I think right now, if I've gotten it right, there is globally a sort of window that has opened where it's become a little bit more favorable to support greater state intervention in ensuring social protections. You're starting to see a little bit more favor coming into things like ensuring basic incomes or having funds for emergencies and things like that. And overall, you're also seeing in some ways a sort of a greater emphasis on national manufacturing policies, kind of moving away from relatively older ideas of globalization and things like that, asking for greater roles of national governments. I'm wondering where something like the topic of social safety nets in India would kind of fit within this, because I think there are both unique circumstances in India which make it a little bit different from global contexts. But at the same time, I'm wondering if global contexts allow for certain kinds of new debates to enter India and kind of influence the way social safety nets would evolve. I hope I made sense in that. I'm not quite sure if I got it right.
No, you're actually spot on. India is not an exception to much of what's happening in the rest of the world. It's an exception in terms of the way things happen in India, but then there are peculiarities that every country has. So, to give the most prominent of these big protection programs have been Brazil and Mexico's case, where these conditional cash transfers kind of just made the world realize, oh, this is a way you can solve poverty. And in India too, there have been debates around maybe going for conditional cash transfers before going for cash transfers directly. So India is not very different, I guess, in that sense. And that's what a lot of book has informed my own understanding of this issue. Latin America being the biggest one in contemporary times in terms of countries which are a similar economic status as India. At the same time, Indonesia, it has been the other very important country which has seen a lot of changes. The history has been a little different because Indonesia was under autocratic rule for a while. So to do a lot of things, it was easier. Also, one of the things which Indonesia has a distinct advantage over India is far more decentralized and much discretionary in terms of its decentralization. So things, they are more responsive to its citizen. Of course, Indonesia doesn't have as much vibrant business environment that India has, but on a per capita income, they're not very different. So that's the one country India should learn from. They had similar PDS kind of a scheme. They had health insurance. They're still grappling with the way to actually design their health insurance program, something like an RSBY or Ayushman Bharat. Brazil and Mexico had an advantage in terms of they went to that route because of what IMF did to those countries in terms of huge inequalities, and then they realized they really need to care for the people. It happened probably in a different way in India, where post-liberalization we realized that though we have larger resources to spend on the poor, let's do it, and the ways could be different. So they're more driven by international organizations than India, where it was mostly through civil society activism. And that's why, if you remember the graph that I had in terms of ideas, interests, and so these ideas are influenced by what's happening in the rest of the world. So there has been a lot of learning across these contexts, because this is something that I'm talking about in the recent past. Of course, India or Indonesia or Brazil and Mexico have a lot to learn about how other Western nations, especially France and Germany, went about it. But they went about this in an era where manufacturing was taking on. And that's why this stress on manufacturing, even in the US now, because you realize to create actually gainful employment, an employment where worker feels a sense of dignity is manufacturing. But of course, it's easier said than done. Most countries are struggling how to do that. Some of the ways people are suggesting is to talk about green growth and industrialization. But these are still ideas we don't know. We don't know if countries which have missed the bus, as Danny Rodriguez calls it, of manufacturing will be able to create similar kind of dignified and gainful employment. We don't know. And that's why social protection becomes important, because you know that citizens can at least have something through this. I mean, you can't create the kind of jobs that one would require. And suboptimal, surely, but what else do you do? So in terms of efficiency, it's not efficient. Many of these programs, even moving from in-kind transfers to cash transfers, but these programs exist because things are inefficient. Markets also don't deliver in that way, and the economy. It's a suboptimal solution. That's where it begins.
So we have. Ashley, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have two questions. So one, I am curious about the role of housing in social protection. You just briefly mentioned PMAY in the beginning, but if you can reflect on how housing factors into social protection in India, if it doesn't, and how that compares globally, and where you see maybe like the lack of housing being also a factor in why things are not maybe going great. And then the other question is the choice to think about social protection, social safety nets as this kind of linear structural transformation that happens in countries. Because like in the graph you showed where there were 4 steps to structural transformation, I think from my understanding, we have schemes that are across all 4 of those, just at different levels of success or, like on-ground implementation. So that linear narrative didn't make that much sense to me. So if you can like talk about both of those.
So, no, you actually touched the raw nerve on both of these questions. No, that's where, if I'm a critical person looking at this book, these are some of the challenges in our narrative. So first of all, on PMAY, the Awas Yojana, so this is something that I haven't discussed much in the book because there's not much literature on that. There's a very recent report, actually it came out, I think last week, about people not having access and the challenges of it. So PMAY is something, there is very little empirical work on that. And I looked in the schemes which had more empirical work. And PMAY, there's lots of corruption, the way it's implemented. But again, these are my opinions. There is very little research in that. So if someone like you who's interested in these issues, that's a great place to begin. There is very little data. It's a new program. Much of the work that exists is kind of anecdotal in terms of saying that these are the challenges of people. You're not finding beneficiaries. They are probably not getting the benefits. House is not being made, but then that's for most of these programs. So I won't answer much to that question because of lack of much evidence around it, I couldn't create much. There was no data also in, unfortunately, NSS or other surveys don't exist, who don't have much information on these for me to also kind of understand how they are being implemented, what potentially could be those programs. Even from across the globe, empirical evidence on housing programs is not so much, because much of the public housing is a different kind of debate than PMAY, which happens in the rest of the world. So again, a very important area of research, which is open. On the linear narrative, yes, this is a linear narrative which has its problem. I'm an economist. That's how I've been trained to deal with issues. But of course, there are challenges, and we have different programs which exist along different dimensions of the transition that I talked about. But this linear dimension is actually not presented where India is right now. This is generally what has happened over a period of time when a country has greater, when this is abroad across countries where you have more resources, people are more democratically empowered, you can spend on move from needs to preventive to promotive and transformational impact. So this is just to impress the audience upon the idea that initially you may not have resource to do it, but you slowly chip away with what you can. And these are definitely not linear. And the clear example of this is actually something that I didn't talk about apart from Latin America, are East Asian economies, which did it from much lower resource, but they did other things. They improved public systems, they did land reforms, they did other things to ensure that they could move from there. And policy making or policy process, of course, is not linear, and I am not denying it. But that graph is not saying that. It's generally saying this is how you think about an issue. But yeah, linear way is not the best way to think about it. But unfortunately, my training has its drawbacks.
So actually, just taking from that, and there's another question on the Zoom which I'll just incorporate into what I'm asking. But we're sitting in a room of people who will ask these questions for the next 50 years, right? Like either our fellows or if we're alive for 50 years within climate change. But what are the key kind of action points that you want us to take away? And the question on Zoom was that, are there evaluations and audits of the efficacy of these welfare schemes, right? And we are all in our roles are playing a part in evaluating, taking these messages forward, doing the research to kind of break these things down, looking at our own populations that we're interested in terms of equity and seeing how they link. So there are lots of open gaps and questions that I see. What do you think those are in terms of what we should all be taking away into our kind of research or policy careers from this kind of very systems approach to looking at how social policy is working?
Right. So that's something that I am also trying to learn through writing this book in terms of what to focus on and how to think about this. So the systems approach allows us to understand things from a more encompassing manner. Like say, I read papers and I also write papers like what happened to food security because of PDS, say, or how does your out-of-pocket health expenditure change because of access to a health insurance. But this again looks at a very narrow way of impact through consumption expenditure. And at that point in time, maybe 5 years since you got it. These are very important to actually understand because many of these outcomes were the scope of those programs, but a systems approach would kind of lead us to think a little beyond and think about the context in which you saw this impact. Maybe years later things will change. Maybe implementation was different in this context. And also was out-of-pocket health expenditure the only way to think about it? Maybe there are other ways. Like people would write papers about toilet construction and its impact on health outcomes of children much later, or even educational outcomes because they could access better quality of toilets, so they were less ill, which means they could learn more from the class and go on. But there are a range of things. One can also question what happened in the mothers, what happened, how the social cohesion around issues changed in a particular region. So these are different questions that different researchers would pick what interests them. Not all of us can answer the question from a complete systemic way, but at least the more we are mindful of what factors we should think about, I think the research in some ways would become better defined and more useful. You can't answer all the question in a research paper or even in a book, but at least you know where you are grounded in terms of your research and its potential drawbacks. So I like the linear argument question because that's something that someone will ask, and we need to be. That's why informed of the system in which our arguments operate or we found.
And I think with that, I think we can close. I want to say again, thank you so much for sharing and creating this body of work. Because I think after the pandemic, even in our own work, we've seen so many of these questions come up, and there's never been a composite kind of area where these policies have been reviewed. So thank you, and everyone, please download the book. It's open access.
Yes, please do that.
It's a pleasure to have an open access book to talk about. So thank you so much,
yes,
Anjali.
Thank you so much for having me.